Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's so good to see you, and I want to welcome back those of you who have not yet been back to campus. Welcome back for the first time, and for those of you who keep coming back, thank you for coming. I think this is going to be a process, and we need to keep welcoming people back in person and encouraging people that it feels safe and normal, and there's a real benefit to coming in person. Last night at Kabbalat Shabbat, I spoke about Tisha B'Av tonight. And so this morning, I'd like to speak about the Torah just briefly. I'd like to speak about the Parsha, because I think it's really important and doesn't ever get enough due, because Tisha B'Av usually falls out right around here, and there are ideas around Tisha B'Av like suffering and tragedy, Zionism, the importance of Israel. All those things take precedence usually. Today I'd like to take a break and speak about one of the very important lessons that Moses gives us in this final book of Devarim. I once heard Rabbi David Wolpe deliver a large teaching, a lesson on the maturation process of Moses, which is incredible. When I was a mere civilian, before I was a rabbi, I really drew inspiration from Abraham. That was the story that brought me back in so many ways to being more involved as a Jew. I related to him as an adult and as a father and as a husband and as a person who was on this kind of journey. Since becoming a rabbi, I have to admit that I relate more and more and more to Moses. Whether or not the seasoning of 5 years of rabbinical school influences that, or whether in fact it's the growing complaint box sometimes that influences that, the idea that you interact with this people that's our people no matter what, and that you are on a journey and they are on a journey, and sometimes that journey seems perfectly aligned. That is the dance that rabbis and congregations, the leaders and their people are often involved in. So today, while the Parsha is really about the fact that this is going to be the last teaching, the last book for the people before Moses leaves, I'd like to focus really on Moses himself and what each of us can learn from Moses. Because after all, in each of our lives, we're the Moses in our own life. What I wrote briefly in the message was that of all of the lessons that Moses teaches, an important one that we should draw beginning this week through the end of Simchas Torah is that each of us has a last book or a last chapter in our life. And instead of dismissing it and saying, it's the end, I've done a lot, Moses welcomes it, and he grasps the opportunity, and he writes perhaps the best book, the best chapter of his life is the last chapter of his life. I'd like to argue. I'd like to argue that the Walter Matthau Moses is even better than the Charlton Heston Moses. And in saying that, I know, Rabbi, are you nuts? The younger Moses was at the burning bush. He went up to Sinai. He brought us out of Egypt. There is a maturity and a sincerity and a wisdom to the Moses of Deuteronomy. The Moses who explains the events of our journey and also explains his thought process in the journey, even if it's difficult for us to take. I'll just use one example. At the very beginning of Moses' story, in Exodus chapter 2, he sees an Egyptian beating a Jew, and his reaction is he kills the Egyptian. And he buries him. No words. And then he sees the next day 2 Jews fighting. He asks them why they're fighting. They turn, of course. This is his first introduction to the Jewish people, perhaps. They turn to him and say, "What's it to you? What, are you going to beat one of us and kill us like you did that Egyptian yesterday?" And it's a fascinating verse in the Torah. He turns around, he says, "Vayira Moshe," Moses was afraid, "Vayomer achen noda hadavar." Surely the matter, the davar, is known. Who is he speaking to? Himself, clearly. He's not speaking to either of these Jewish people. It's clear that they don't care what he has to say. They don't see him as any kind of authority. It wouldn't make sense if he was speaking to them. He has, in fact, nobody that listens to him. We go just 2 chapters later in chapter 4, he's standing at the burning bush. He's standing at the burning bush and God tells him, "I have chosen you to go down and redeem the children of Israel from Egypt." And there's a series of responses that Moses has. All of them essentially are along the lines of, "I don't think you've thought this plan out very well." Because Moses knows Pharaoh. He knows where he has to go. And his last excuse that he gives God, the very last, chapter 4, verse 10, "Lo ish devarim anochi." I am not a man of devarim. I am not a man of words. And we interpret that as he has trouble speaking, because he goes on to explain that he has trouble with his tongue or his lips or whatever it might be. However you want to understand that, whether today in a world of special education we would say that he has a speech impediment or there is something with him that he would need some kind of therapy, he matures over the course of his life to be the man who delivers a book called Devarim. The person who stood before God at the burning bush and said, "Lo ish devarim anochi," becomes ish devarim. The child who said, "I don't want to be religious, I want to be a filmmaker," grew up to be a rabbi. And I bet that if each of us thinks back to moments in our life, and we could go back in time and speak to that child or that teenager or that young person, we would shock that young person with some of the decisions and the realities of our adult lives. Moses, in this book, in this opening, warns us, don't be surprised if you start out as a person who is not a person of words. And your story ends, the final chapter of your life ends with Ele hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. These are the devarim, these are the words that Moses spoke to the whole people of Israel. His first spoken line in the Torah is said to nobody. Is spoken to himself, essentially. Then to God he says, "I can't speak." And this final chapter is him speaking with the entire children of Israel listening. Each of us is capable of so much more than we give ourselves credit. And what Sefer Devarim shows me is that we're capable of achieving more even in the final chapters of our life. Whether it be teaching family members or others the lessons of our life, as Moses is doing here in Devarim. Moses stands and teaches all of us our history once again, our journey once again. He wants us to understand the world through his eyes once again before he closes his eyes for the last time. The lessons of Devarim is not only the content of what Moses says, but the act of Devarim, the act of becoming a person of Devarim, should inspire each of us to think, between now and the last time that I close my eyes, what are the craziest dreams that I hope to achieve? Because there's a chance for each of us to become the person that we had thought our whole lives was impossible. Moses shows us it just might take every second of our life, every ounce of willpower to achieve that goal. Shabbat shalom, everybody.